Foal of the Wastes, written by Etyco Philly. Chapter 2. Wings of Freedom. Freedom. I couldn't believe I finally had it. I'd stayed a blank flake for longer than the vast majority of stable foals, and a part of me had started worrying I'd never get mine. In hindsight, it made perfect sense. I'd never seen a gun prior to today. How would you earn your cutie mark in guns if you hardly knew anything about them? Admittedly, I still didn't know much, but at least I'd seen one now. My stomach growled, pulling me out of my awe. My father had mentioned food, and I definitely needed some right now. I moved over to his lifeless body, telekinetically opening his saddlebags, and took a look inside them. I found 4 cans of apples that you could buy from the vending machine, as well as a medium-sized canteen with the number 4 engraved and painted on it. From Mother's books, I knew the canned fruit was produced on the completely sealed-off 5th floor. I'd even asked her about it, but not even she knew what was exactly going on upstairs. Advanced magical talismans, probably. According to her, there had never been any accidents that required any sort of maintenance up there. I pulled on the tab to open the can, and started picking out the apple slices. They weren't nearly as good as when a cook prepared them, but they were tasty regardless. They were also hydrating, which made me realize I hadn't drunk anything either.
Heck, have I really run out of stable dehydrated and hungry? What is wrong with me?
I thought as I finished the last bite of apple. I had put entirely too little thought into it before leaving the safety of my home. Then I drank the diluted juice the apples had been floating in. Not very delicious, but it was better than wasting it. I tossed the can away. My bodily needs finally taken care of, I looked around. The cave consisted of a single path which turned right, where my father had come from. That seemed like the way out. I looked behind me at the stable door. Just like on the inside, there was a terminal here. To the right of the door. Something about it struck me as odd, however. The device seemed to be a slightly different model from the ones in the stable. Curiosity piqued and I approached it. The keys and monitor had been covered in a thick layer of dust, until some pony, presumably my father, recently wiped them close to clean. I clicked a key, and was met with a familiar prompt.
Stable Tech Terminal. Please issue your official Stable Tech username and password.
Again, something struck me as off. I stared at the green letters on screen for a few seconds before it hit me. It wasn't asking for a Stable 4 password. This was an external terminal, unrelated to the ones inside. Of course, my father's password hadn't worked. He probably didn't even have an account on this terminal. This thought, however, did not stop me from trying to log in regardless, but with no success.
I guess I really am stuck out here, aren't I?
I mentally kicked myself for leaving the stable on a whim. I would now have to survive out here, all alone. The latter part of that thought didn't really bother me all that much. I didn't regret killing Concerto, not even a little bit. My life would be easier without him in it. My textbooks had described the Wasteland as extremely dangerous and deadly, but that didn't apply to everywhere in the Wasteland, right? This cave seemed safe, for one. Hey, my pip book hadn't even shown any radiation, so this place was probably harmless, albeit limited in food. I needed to leave, and soon. Time was food. I walked back towards my father's corpse and undid the saddlebags he wore. The harness I sported appeared to be made with such bags in mind, and I was able to slip them underneath it. The next step was to catch up with Mother. She had a lead of at least 4 hours on me, so catching up would be difficult. I didn't know where she was headed, but I only had one direction to go. Beyond the turn, the path picked up as a staircase, carved into the rock. After a few minutes of climbing it, I got bored. The cave was mostly unimpressive, and the only thing changing up the scenery were the lamps, some of which had stopped working. Sometimes, several in a row were dark, and the cave went dark for the next few dozen stairs. Nothing happened to take my mind off my ever-increasing boredom. I hoped there would be less walking in the wasteland. This sucked.
If only I had someone to talk to, or even a conversation to listen to.
It took a good 15 minutes until I finally reached a different area. I spotted a metal fence. Behind it, I could see the sky. It was vast and gray, like a never-ending stable wall. In the books I'd read, it had always been blue. I was surprised I couldn't see any clouds either. Or maybe what I saw were clouds, and they just spanned the entire sky. That made me yearn to see the actual sky. How long until the clouds would clear? I opened the door built into the fence and left the cave. Stepping outside for the first time of my life, I was blinded by the brightness of it all. Something I could only assume to be grass tickled my lower legs and hooves. The next thing I felt was a frigid gust on my face. It wasn't much colder than in the tunnel, but the sensation of fresh air hitting my nostrils and lungs was so novel that it briefly left me dumbfounded. I'd experienced icy winds in the vents, but none of them had been anything like this. This was so much more vivid. The air was clean, but it wasn't sterile. It was pure. This almost reminded me of those mint candies Mother would give me. I mentally admonished myself for not taking any with me. However, as much as I deplored how hasty my departure had been, any regrets I had about the act itself were gone. I wouldn't trade this feeling for anything in the world. When my shock faded, I noticed that my view was echoed by a small hill, which I decided to scale. My ears perked up, picking up a shrill little sounds from around me. The rustling of the grass below my hooves, the distant tumble of a rock, the nearby snaps of branches, the omnipresent whoosh of the wind. All of these new sounds had replaced what I had grown so used to. Gone was the ever-present coil whine, gone were the occasional conversations that echoed throughout the vents, gone was the constant fan whir. After a few moments I found myself on top of the small hill, surrounded by dead trees. From here I could see through the treetops and observe the whole world. At least that's how it felt, given how it utterly overwhelmed me. Just so vast. I could see, I didn't even know how far, several hundreds of meters, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions. My mind really couldn't comprehend such distances, and my head started spinning. I tried taking my eyes off the endless vastness, only to look up and be met with something even worse. The cloud layer I'd seen earlier suddenly seemed thousands of times bigger. It stretched in every direction, and was so far up. I felt myself growing woozy and forced my eyes shut, looking away when I opened them again. To distract myself from the dizzying expanse, I focused on my immediate surroundings. The grass underneath my hooves was a dull yellow, very similar to one of the shades present in my mane, unlike the deep green I'd been promised by my books. Not very interesting, but at least it didn't trigger vertigo. Most of the trees around me were bleak, sickly green. The rest, a small minority, were dead and leafless instead. I recognized the live ones as conifers of some kind. Back before the war, they'd kept their color all year round. Was this why they'd survived so long? Turning my head around, I was faced with a giant wall of stone. In contrast with what was in front of me, this cliff was mostly rock, with few patches of grass and the occasional tree where the slope allowed it. As my eyes followed the stone wall up, I felt vertiginous again. I forced myself to look away at the trees surrounding me. As my other senses slowly acclimated to the outside, I finally noticed it. My EFS was blank, empty, barren, completely devoid of any bars. My interface suddenly seemed so much cleaner. Now that I was finally starting to grasp some of the longer distances, albeit not the very long ones, I looked downhill. Through the trees I spotted a pre-war road that had aged quite well. It was surprising that even after so many years after the spells had detonated, the road still existed. Admittedly, it was not in a great condition, but it still existed. I started my way down from the hill towards the concrete. This side was much steeper than where I'd come from, and after a few small steps I decided to take a gentler slope to my left. The ground here was covered with mud and dead branches. The feeling of the cool mud in my hooves surprised me. It felt like it looked vicious and cold. For some reason, pressing my hooves into it was extremely fun. I did it again and again until I stomped my hoof hard enough to make it splash on my pickbuck screen. I cleaned it with a swipe of my fetlock. I felt childish, playing with something as mundane as mud. But in the moment I didn't care. After about a minute, I finally grew bored enough of the silliness. I used the branches to avoid slipping on the mud, and noticed that some dead shrubs remained in some places. Prior to the war, this forest likely had its ground covered in smaller plants of all sorts. As it stood, however, all that remained were dead plants, roots, and mud. My imagination ran wild and conjured up images of tall, green ferns like the one in the atrium, but in unimaginable quantities. I closed my eyes and let myself marvel at the idea. I blinked my eyes open, and the image was gone, replaced by the sickly trees and brown sludge. However, anywhere I looked, I saw no sign of Mother. No hoofprints, no recent trash, nothing. There were probably traces of her passage everywhere around me, but I just didn't know where to look. I had read that certain species used to hunt and track wild animals to survive, and that they had learned such skills for years. Of course, I wouldn't be able to notice subtle signs, no matter how well I tried to look. Instead, I needed to figure out where she had gone based on nothing but speculation. From here, there were two logical paths to follow. I could either go up or downhill. Given how steep the mountain behind me was, I doubted that the trail could continue much further. I figured she would have a similar line of thought. Even if she did step upwards first, she would eventually need to head back down towards the foot of the mountain. The only case where she wouldn't eventually end up moving downhill was if the road somehow continued past the mountain, and if Mother was aware of that. Satisfied with my reasoning, I set out downhill. Well, there were many variables that I couldn't control in this, like her exact thought process or the roads. However, it seemed like my best bet. Another thought crossed my mind. What if she had never left the stable? I hadn't seen her leave, and neither had my father. Well, in that case she would be disappointed to find out that I left. The idea had made me stop dead in my tracks and consider turning around. However, if she really was out there, I couldn't afford to lose any more time. I started walking once again. Besides, after seeing the world out here, the idea of going back into the stable made my skin crawl. Yes, the vastness of the world scared me, but I couldn't go back. Not to mention, I wouldn't have to be the overmare if I wasn't in the stable. I wouldn't need to study 12 hours a day. I wouldn't need to sit through etiquette lessons. I wouldn't need to listen to Mother go on about the best ways to trick a pony into trusting you. The idea of being alone out here terrified me, but now that I was free, I was willing to take that risk. I arrived at a bend in the road. From here, I could see it turn on the other side of the artist's slope. I weighed my options. I could either follow the road all the way, or attempt to take a shortcut here. It was steep, and the ground probably slippery, but it would save me at least 2, 5, 20? I had no idea how much of a distance this actually was. Minutes of walking.
Screw it. Time is essential if I want to catch up to Mother.
I stepped off the concrete and onto the muddy slope. I quickly gained momentum, which both excited and scared me. However, I couldn't manage to slow myself down. My speed quickly became too much for me to handle, and I tripped on a twig, tumbling straight down. I landed face first in a puddle of mud next to the concrete. I spit out the dirt in my mouth and licked a clean patch of my coat, hoping to remove unpleasant taste and texture from my tongue. Luckily for me, I landed on a rock-free spot, and the impact irritated none of my bruises. I thanked my luck, then trotted back onto the road. Gross result or no, this shortcut had saved me a good bit of walking. I looked at the next edge. This one was not as steep as the previous, and my confidence grew. If I could overcome that big one, surely this tiny one would pose no threat. As I picked up momentum, I started fearing I'd trip again. This time, however, I knew what to expect. I concentrated on keeping my speed under control and paid extra attention to the ground below. Any of those branches could be my downfall if my hoof got caught on them. The dash was over me in just a few thrilling seconds, and I safely reached the flat road and slowed down to a trot. I giggled, proud of my achievement. Breathing heavily, I took a moment to think. The impatient part of my brain kept telling me to keep taking shortcuts. The rational part of my brain knew the risk wasn't worth it. With those two in a deadlock, a third part of my brain interjected.
But it's fun.
And so I tried once more. Once more, the forest proved no match for my agility, as I managed to not eat dirt again. I was getting good at this. I giggled through my panting. I felt like a full half my age, playing outside and not caring if I got dirty. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pang of sadness, and wondered what else I'd missed because of this stupid stable. I'd also never asked Mother to go to the running track on the atrium floor. I hadn't realized what I'd been missing. Just the feeling of the wind on my face would have brought me so much joy, even if it was sterile, stable air. Then again, she might not have let me go anyway. Every time I could take a reasonable shortcut, I would. I conquered 2 more slopes, boosting my confidence even further. On the third, I started running with no respect for my legs' ability to keep up. Of course I tripped, tumbling down until I fell flat on my stomach, branches and rocks digging into my sides, some of them violently slamming into my bruises. I yelped from the pain and my vision blurred with tears. I turned on my back and softly rubbed the worst injuries for a moment, sniffling. The ache slowly faded away, and a few minutes later I stood up again. And then I noticed it. A single red bar appeared on my EFS. What did that mean? The only time I'd seen a bar other than white was when he beat me. Did that mean this pony robot here wanted to hurt me as well? Out here I could assume that things appeared on my EFS were on the same floor as me, so I looked in its direction, expecting whatever I was expecting, the thing floated between trees wasn't it. From where I was, I could only make out a sort of deformed green ball. Whatever it was, I did not want to get close to it to find out. I levitated out my pistol and took aim. Since the awful creature did not seem interested in me, I took my time to line up my guns, aim aids with the terrible shape. I had a hard time figuring out whether my shot was going to hit, mostly because of the pistol's metal obscured my sight of the creature. I pulled the trigger and missed. The creature then seemed to notice me and started moving in my direction.
Oh, pony feathers.
I attempted 3 more shots. By the third, it was close enough that I could tell that it was vaguely bug-like. It was also close enough that my mediocre marksmanship was finally able to hit it. Thankfully, it only took a bullet to make it pop in a shower of graying green chunks. The unexpected spray of disgusting flesh suddenly made me nauseous. Very nauseous. Nauseous enough that I lost my lunch. I coughed and cleared my throat. I took out my canteen and swished the water around my mouth, before spitting it out into the mud. I was wasting water, yes, but I needed to get the aftertaste out of my mouth. I'd take dirt over vomit any day. It was odd how my father's brains exploding had awed and amused me, while this disgusted me. In my defense, this thing had been just so incredibly vile. Then again, maybe there was something wrong with me. And then I spotted another red bar on my EFS. I turned my head and saw another one of these abominations, presumably drawn by the noise. I tried aiming at it, but my telekinesis wasn't stable yet. I needed something to help me aim. Wasn't there a spell I could learn that would assist me with targeting?
But wait, there is.
I thought, remembering the odd spell program I'd never found a use for back in Stable 4. If I remembered correctly, I searched the side of my pip book and found the button labeled SATS.
Stable Tech Arcane Targeting Spell.
I talked with Mother about it. She'd called it a marvel of pony spellcasting. Her words rang through my mind.
In theory, a regular unicorn would be able to cast the spell, but you would have to learn the entire spell by heart, and that's not something anybody could feasibly do.
I snapped out of my reverie before it got me hurt and clicked the button, slipping it into SATS for the first time in my life. The world came to a crawl. The sleek white interface similar to my EFS appeared in my vision. A single white panel with the number 5 on it floated above the bug. Underneath the text, Bloat Sprite. Was that what it was called? How the heck did my pip book know that? That had to be an impressive spell.
I wonder if I can learn it.
My excitement for the magic faded as I quickly realized what the number meant. My likelihood to hit. Had my odds ever been this bad? Had I gotten incredibly lucky with my one shot? Hard to tell. In hindsight, but right now I needed to move closer. I did not like the idea. Approaching this thing seemed like the opposite of a smart plan. Now the question was, how? I had to leave SATs, but there was an appropriate button for that in the interface that had just appeared, but I couldn't understand how to actually click it. I attempted to focus on it like I do with telekinesis, and succeeded. I slowly moved closer while letting the bloat sprite approach as well. Once the distance had been halved, the bug shot a spike at me. I did not like the sharp twang that the projectile made on the concrete road next to me, and I definitely did not want to discover what the sound would be if it hit me. I clicked SATs once again. This time, the spell gave me a 36% likelihood to hit. I queued one shot. I didn't like my odds, but I also didn't like the bug's projectiles. To my extreme relief, the shot hit, and the sprite exploded in a shower of disgusting goop. Even though I'd been expecting it, seeing it up close was even more disgusting than before, and the nausea hit me. I tried to keep it down, but ended up dry heaving. I did not like those at all. At all. I really hoped I wouldn't have to deal with them ever again. Feeling much weaker, I didn't dare take any more shortcuts, except when the slope was so mild I could just slowly walk across. Eventually I spotted a wooden hut through the trees, some ways away from the main road, connected by a dirt path. The ambient light had significantly decreased, and I suspected I had 3 hours before nightfall, at the very most. Given that I was drained and didn't see any other shelter anywhere nearby, I decided to stay here for the time being. I followed the dirt path and arrived in front of the hut, and my pip-buck flashed, showing me a name for the place. Arcane Spark Chalet. I didn't know what a chalet was, but I was once more impressed by my pip-buck's ability to find names for things. Curious, I checked the map, and found that I'd come from the south, and that cave I'd come out of had been labeled Stable Tech Artificial Cavern. Stable 4 was right behind it, labeled as expected. My map also called the whole area Foal Mountain, but didn't add a specific marker like it had with the previous 3 locations. I walked up to the hut, chalet, and attempted to open the front door. I was glad to find it unlocked. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. There were 2 doors on the opposite side where I'd entered from, both closed. On my left, I found a stove. I'd read about those. A sink and an armchair, oriented to face the stove. On the right, oh. That was a pony skeleton, a unicorn to be exact. Part of my brain yelled that that wasn't the appropriate reaction to an old corpse. I swiftly ignored it. He or she had been sitting in a chair, head resting on the table, using their hooves as a pillow. In front of them lay 2 recordings, in an out-of-commission terminal. The window behind the table had a view rivaling one of the artificial cave's exit. However, with the darkness, I couldn't see nearly as far. I pushed open one of the doors with my telekinesis. The bathroom had a toilet, a barrel, a mirror, and a yellow box with pink butterflies on it. I couldn't see myself in the mirror, being too short to have it at eye level. Curious just how terrible I looked, I stood up on my hind legs, using the sink as an anchor for my front hooves. Through the mirror, I could see dirt marring the light pink coat on my face, the ugly brown utterly overwhelming the other shade.
Having a practically white coat won't be convenient out here.
Staying clean was probably going to be a pain, too. A flash of hope crossed my mind, and I opened the tap. To my surprised delight, water actually flowed from the faucet. My Pippa clicked slightly at the water, but that wasn't enough of a deterrent for me. I pushed my face under the stream, wincing from the cold, before rubbing my face with a hoof. I then took a sip of the water and found it had a bitter aftertaste. I took my head from under the faucet and swept a wet strand of mint mane out of my face. As my Pip-Buck was still clicking, I gave it a glance. One of the gauges, which had remained at 0.0 my entire life, was now indicating 2.3 rads. I gulped, realizing I had no idea how much that represented, and that I had potentially just ingested a lethal amount of radiation. I closed the tap. This wasn't going to be pleasant, but it had to be done. I took the toothbrush sitting on the counter and wiped it clean of dust. Then, I went over to the shower and pushed the toothbrush's handle down my throat. For the third time that day, I lost the content of my stomach. When I was done, the rad gauge on my pip book indicated a slightly less worrying value, 0.4 rads. Canned food would be my main source of hydration then. Too bad I only had a few cans of that. I'd also avoid washing myself in this, unless all of the water in the Wasteland was just as irradiated. That possibility hadn't even crossed my mind. What if everyone was dead out here? And what if there was no way I could possibly survive?
Everything certainly looks dead, except those awful bugs.
I drew a deep breath and stared into my own red eyes. This was no time for panic. What were the odds that no place in the Wasteland had usable water? I needed more information before drawing any conclusions. However, I still wasn't going to test my luck drinking this stuff. I turned my attention to the yellow box. It had a lock built into it, but as I pulled on the box, it came open with no resistance. Inside, I found a bottle filled with a pink liquid, 2 rolls of brown cloth, a bottle labeled disinfectant, and finally, an instruction manual. I put all of those items in my saddlebags to get them to show up on my pip book. I found out the pink liquid was a healing potion, and the rolls of cloth, magical bandages. I would read the manual when I had time. I turned my attention to the table in the main room and levitated the recordings to the armchair, before sitting down. My stomach grumbled as I was reminded that I had effectively not eaten today. I pulled out a can of apples, opened it, and levitated out a piece of fruit. While I chewed, I inserted the first recording into my pip book and heard a pop, then static, and then a mare's voice.
Hello, my name's Arcane Spark. I figured I might as well record something on my last day, mostly to feel less alone. Fuck, if I'm lucky, someone might even listen to this, and I'll be remembered by at least one living pony.
She chuckled dryly, and I swallowed the slice.
Well, looks like I chose the perfect week to go on vacation,
she said without a hint of sarcasm. I levitated another slice toward my lips.
And I genuinely mean that. We all knew it was coming. Eventually, fuckers were gonna blow us all up. I'm just glad I can spend my last day up while I got a nice view. I gotta admit, those green fireworks did look pretty from up here. At least they were good for one thing. Makes me glad there was no fog today.
She laughed, and the recording went quiet for a few moments.
In theory, I could go up the mountain and crawl into that stable, but I'd need to walk a few hours through radioactive snow. Maybe if I'd bothered actually visiting, I could have just teleported into it, but at this rate, I'd just have a bunch of hops, and then walk the rest. And even if I were to somehow survive that, I'd just contaminate the stable. Besides, from what I know of that stable, I wouldn't want to live there anyway. Nah, I've accepted my death here. Just hope it won't be painful.
The recording went quiet. Chewing on a bit of an apple, I levitated the other recording into my pip book.
Update. It's very fucking painful.
She coughed and hacked violently, and I could hear the fluid in her lungs.
I wish I had my gun, and I don't think I have the strength to move my desk to open the safe. I should have thought of it sooner. Anyway, speaking hurts more than expected, so I'll be signing off. Goodbye, world.
The voice gave a dry chuckle, as if laughing at her own joke, before fading out.
Huh. Interesting,
I remarked, and went back to eating my apples. I wondered who she'd been. Her name didn't mean anything to me, and I wondered what her cutie mark had been. Why was hers the only house around here? What safe had she been talking about? So many questions. I picked out the last slice and drank the rest of the can's content. I put the empty tin on the kitchen counter and moved back to the table. With some effort, I managed to levitate it out of the way. Underneath it, I found a latch built into the floor. I flipped it open and found a combination lock similar to one of my father's. I tried a few combinations, hoping to get extraordinarily lucky. It went about as expected. Next, I attempted to figure it out by putting my ear to the metal surface. I'd read about it in some bad novels, and I'd always wondered how effective that method would actually be. In my case, it proved to be entirely worthless, and I finally lost interest. Now that I had stopped moving for a long while, I started noticing the cold seeping into my body. It wasn't a feeling I was very familiar with. The temperature inside the stable was highly regulated after all. Of course, I'd felt instances of frigid air or water, but this was the first time my body itself felt chilly. Given I'd exhausted the interesting options in the room, I turned to the other door. Probably a bedroom, I figured. My hunch proved correct, and I found a bed, a bedside table, and a bookshelf. To my utter delight, the latter was actually populated. I turned on my Pip-Book light and started looking through the shelf. The bottom shelves held books, while the top shelf held magazines, organized with their covers facing forward on 3 different vertical levels. Most of the magazines seemed more pony-focused, and had some oddly dressed mares in weird poses. I couldn't understand why any pony would wear such a thing, or stand and lie in such uncomfortable ways. To the very right, 3 magazines stood out by their different cover styles. The front one was an edition of Spell Matrices Digest, with a blue unicorn on the cover. The big title read,
Exclusive interview with Arcane Spark, inventor of Sats.
So this unicorn had kept a magazine of an interview of herself. I could respect that. The one behind it read, Beyond Your Imagination, with the front page title of 10 Tips and Tricks to Strengthen Your Telekinesis. The last one was an issue of Fili Fatale. It looked boring. I wiped a layer of dust off the bedside table and then levitated the 2 magazines onto it, wiping the dust off of them as well. I then turned my attention to the books. From the titles, most were pre-war novels. A few even seemed interesting. I levitated them onto the table, cleaning them off. Finally, again on the very right, I found a few more technical books. A dictionary, a guide to gardening, and a volume that read The Big Book of Arcane Science. Another book caught my eye. The Egghead's Guide to Running. After consideration, I put it back on the shelf. Running wasn't hard, was it? I'd managed on my first try. Sort of. A book. 2 if I counted the one on firearms, and 2 magazines. My saddlebags were going to be heavy, but at least I had books. I checked my Pip-Book's time. B shift was about to end, so B shift had been lined up with the outside's afternoon. Fascinating. The time also explained why I wasn't sleepy yet, despite being physically exhausted. This was perfect, as I could finally learn some gun terminology. Reading by Pip-Book light wasn't ideal, so I tried my luck again by flipping the light switch. And, as expected, the ceiling lamp stayed dark. Over the half hour I'd been there, the light outside had almost entirely faded, and I couldn't make out anything outside the window, except where my Pip-Book light shone. My old fear of getting caught sprung into action, and I turned off the flashlight. With the light source gone, I went momentarily blind before my eyes accustomed to the darkness. I telekinetically shoved the bed out from under the window, then emptied the bookshelf and moved it to block the window. Moving the bed had revealed it was extremely dusty, so I levitated the mattress and quilt through the main room and outside. I shook the hole-ridden quilt and managed to get most of the grime out. The mattress seemed less dirty, but still let out a sizable cloud of dust when I beat it with the ladle. I moved them back inside before locking the door. I'd found the key behind the terminal after a few minutes of searching. Somewhat satisfied with the improved safety, I moved the mattress back to its original position. I took off my equipment in an attempt to make myself comfortable. This, however, proved to be a fruitless endeavor as the still rather dirty quilt was rather itchy. Ideally, I'd sleep without it, but I might die of cold if I tried. I levitated the book on firearms to me and spent the next several hours reading. After a few minutes, I'd gone and grabbed a pencil from the desk in the main room to annotate it. There were many terms I hadn't ever encountered, but with a bit of hard work, I was able to understand most of them from cross-comparing the usages. I'd gotten so invested in it that before I'd noticed, I'd fallen asleep. Footnote. New perk. Bookworm. You get 1 additional skill point for every book and magazine you read, if you're able to understand it. That was Chapter 2 of Foal of the Wastes. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh my gosh, after over a month of barely added content, if any at all. I sincerely apologize for that. I hope I can make it up to you with the promise of 2 things. I've let it be known recently that I've had something in the works. 2 things, actually. One is a story that I've had in mind for a very long time, and with the help of an editor, I will be able to bring it to reality. Currently, Chapter 1 is so long that I might have to split it up into 2 or even 3 chapters. The other thing is that I've gathered several talented voice actors within the community to bring you the first ever audio drama reading of Reading Rainbow by the amazing Korejo. They've written things you might recognize as For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, Into the Dark, Compacti, and many more. Who are the voice actors, you ask? Well, you'll have to find out later. That's all the time I have for tonight, so coming from the Lost One himself, I'll see you on the other side.